Hey everyone.
Hello.
I think it's good morning for most of you.
Good morning.
Yeah.
Good evening.
Morning for me.
Did we start 3 minutes after, as is tradition?
I think we should, and also we don't want people to everyone joins late in general, so we don't want people to miss out the beginning of this. But I was wondering whether the people who are joining this call have been on few enough of the North American calls live so as to not even realize that's our tradition.
That's fair. Give me 1 second. I'm just grab some water.
Yeah. So how many of you guys have been joining any of the other sessions in real time or live?
Tried once and gave up because it's the middle of the night for me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Same. It's like 3 a.m. It's like, but I tend to watch the recording. I haven't done for this week though.
Just while we're waiting, overall, do you feel like the course has still been worthwhile given that you have been watching recordings, or if someone that you know socially but in the same time zone asked whether to join, would you have said that it's actually not worth it given the time zone problems?
Like when we
I think
purchase,
the time zone
yeah,
is not an issue for me. I mean, I've been able to watch the recordings and get, I think, a fair bit of value out of it. Also, the Slack channels are good. Get some random bits of knowledge every now and then. I have not been able to join the live session, so this is my first time seeing what the live thing has to offer. And if this is useful, then something in a friendly time zone would be better. But otherwise, I think the recordings and the Slack kind of do well even async.
Yeah, we are planning to repeat this weekly. This week we're going to do just Q&A, and then I'll probably just set it up as a poll in I think it's called APAC Slack channel. And I'll just do a poll of, do you guys want for next week to do this mix like we've been doing in the office hours that we have during the US day, where you do half of it as breakout session and half is Q&A, or do you want to have all Q&A like we're going to do this week? But I'll put that in Slack and then we can use that to decide what we do for future weeks. Yeah. Should we or after? We're a minute late.
I think everyone's in. I think I counted 12 on the Slack, and there's 12 in the. Actually, that means just we have two more actually, so it's 10 out of 12. Yeah, I mean, let's jump in. I think has anyone watched the videos for this week already, or has it mostly just been week 1 and week 2? Maybe like a thumbs up or a action. Cool.
For this week, I think. Yeah. 3 weeks.
Makes sense.
Yeah, I've watched the lectures, all the lectures, everything up until the lecture for this week, and
Okay.
including the lecture.
Cool. So yeah, it sounds like most of you have seen some of the conversations around just making sure we have good recall metrics, allowing ourselves to use synthetic data to generate these evaluations, and then also once we start introducing production data, being able to figure out how we can segment and classify some of these topics in order to better prioritize. And so yeah, I would love to maybe we can just use the raise hand mechanism in Zoom, and then we can start from there if anyone has any questions that they want to talk about. Happy to just clarify anything.
Yeah, since maybe I can go first. No one has raised their hands. Yeah. Actually, it's definitely very helpful because in my previous role, we started building some stuff. Like I used to work for a graph vendor. So we kind of built like early stages of GraphRag like 2 years ago. But we kind of never thought about like how to do evaluation and everything. Like at one point we had to like create like, even though there's an LLM powering things, but generation of the Cypher queries. But it was like for this particular intent, we will have a API and everything. So with all the what I think over the last 3 weeks, what I've learned is very helpful to like kind of how we could do it now. But one of the things I'm working on now is actually building more of a generic like chat interface Q&A system for students and researchers to work with like any kind of documents. So like because from that perspective, there's no way like I can generate questions across different domains. They might be working on different things because like now I started off with just working with PDFs and Word docs. I'm also kind of thinking of transitioning into what do you say, like PowerPoints and a few other kinds of multimedia where they can upload and work with. So like first question on that is like, is there a way like I can think of putting up a kind of a process where I can evaluate like different domains, and because my Q&A system is going to be RAG is going to be very generic.
Yeah.
Like, so it's like how do you see this like at scale when we want to kind of like optimize over a period of time? What will be kind of an approach I can consider? That's the first question. Second one, yeah, I'll think about it. I've completely forgotten.
Yeah, let's do the first one first. I
Yeah.
imagine there's quite a bit here. So obviously we can still think about potentially using language models to generate synthetic data, right? We can say, given a PowerPoint, what are some questions this PowerPoint answers? We don't even know if by default that the text in the PowerPoint is enough to retrieve that single asset, right? And so I think one of the big challenges is like we might assume that synthetic data is too easy, but that's usually not the case, right? On top of that, what we might find is maybe right now, because we don't have any domain expertise, we can't really do the segmentation on sort of the types of questions people ask, but we will still be able to evaluate, for example, our ability to recall the right assets based off of the file type, right? When I was at Zapier, we had integrations for Sheets, we had integrations for Notion pages, we had a bunch of different notes apps. And what we found was just anytime the answer was supposed to be found in the sheet, we were struggling. And that's because they just embedded the text in the sheet. And so what we did was we built out these summary index where we said, okay, given this sheet, give me like a paragraph description of what the data looks like. And instead of returning the sheet itself, return the summary and have that summary point to the sheet. And then immediately we went from 20% recall to 60% recall. It was still very hard, right? And so if there's many different assets like that, it's worth considering just slicing up those and going, okay, we started allowing people to upload Google Sheets on top of just regular PDFs, but it's not doing very well. We really need to invest the effort into figuring out what we can do about that. That would be like a single example, but generally it's still pretty important to come up with synthetic data. One story I talked about with that was, I just forgot it right away. Oh no. It's late for me now. Was yes, with GitHub issues where we used Paul Graham essays and synthetic data got us 97% recall. We're like, great, this is super easy. Let's try something harder. And then with just GitHub issues, we just realized we couldn't do anything. And so that synthetic data will still help you understand that, because maybe again people are asking questions about what page is that slide on, and you realize like, oh, we do not have the ability to like map what pages are happening, or people maybe start asking about the comments on the slides, like, oh, we don't have the ability to do that either. Now let's go figure out what to invest in. Yeah. Does that give you an example of sort of why maybe it's still okay, and maybe thinking about like the file extension as the first thing we might want to segment across?
Yeah, like one of the early thoughts, because like apart from text, like I still didn't have any view on how to work with tables. But yesterday, the week 3 session, I got like a really good glimpse thanks to you and Dan on the markdown approach. But for images, like I was thinking of extracting and like just creating summaries, but I think that's what the approach you propose. So now, at least in my head, how I'm designing this is like I have all my raw information that I get from the users, but then I create an intermediate layer which I'm going to use as a router mechanism, like with all potentially like summaries and stuff. So that will guide my system retriever to figure out where to go and fetch the right information, rather than trying to look at the source information through the vectors, with the index vectors. Yeah, thanks. Like that's that. I'll pass and I'll pass it on to someone else. Thank you.
So just to make sure I understand it, it sounds like you're building a really horizontal or broadly useful platform. Some of the things that immediately come to mind for me would be if you're totally stumped or you're totally blocked by not having a set of PowerPoints that you can even experiment with, I would start by thinking about, so I don't remember the details. I think PowerPoint now used to be some binary format, but I think now is JSON or YAML. You might be able to synthetically create a bunch of PowerPoints, but even easier than that would be to go and find some corpus of PowerPoints on some topic that you can experiment with. It's not perfect because it's all going to be from one domain, but at least a domain that I'm familiar with that I know there's a bunch of public PowerPoints would be pitch decks for investors. So you go out, get a corpus of those, and now you can do this process. It's not great because it's all from one domain. You want to be cross-domain, but it's better to have one domain than 0 domains. And then on figuring out what are the things we want to extract, you have the additional challenge of there's like an extra layer of indirection here, since you don't know what the use cases will be. I think that you could, for a given client, either have something in the UI where you say, describe to me the type of data that you're going to put in here, and you ask an LLM, what are the things that we're going to want to extract from this data, and maybe you can build that capability with that extra sort of layer in there to figure out what you want to extract, and the LLM determines that. Or you could have it observe the data, but you may want to extract different information for different clients. And if you could either look at their data or have the user tell you what problem they're working on, that might help you build out a programmatic preprocessing pipeline, even without knowing much about what you're preprocessing.
Yeah, that's nice because like now I can create like dynamically create metadata and pass it as options for me to filter as the user starts asking question, like once I get more information on the intent or purpose of working with these documents.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
Yeah,
that
it
helps.
does
Yeah.
it does violate what I think Jason's first rule is, which is look at the data. It's now it's like we're not going to look at the data. We're not even going to know what the data is, and we're just going to have an LLM look at the data. Yeah, it's going to be extra challenging, but those are the things that come to mind for me.
Like, sorry to take up much time, but then like the challenge we had like 2 years ago with this oil and gas company is like they have 50 years worth of legacy information, like
Mhm.
from handwritten notes to everything. Like they have tons and tons of that. And the main reason they even invested into using like LLMs and went with OpenAI and everything at that point in time was they don't have the manual labor to be able to first thing classify, extract, and also they wanted to label information, whether it's like gold standard, like silver and some stuff. They want to fully automate it because of like 50 years worth of legacy information. So that's the kind of like typical clients, like when I engage them, this is kind of like the problems they have. Like that's why when the highlight is always look at the data. Yes, I would love to look at data if it's like tabular, right? To quickly aggregate. You have certain forms of summaries you can look at and figure out there's not a big outlier. There's something like statistically you can figure out what to avoid, what to like look for. But when it comes to text and documents like this, it's still so hard if you have so much volumes of information to go through. That's why it's like very generic. And
Yep.
hopefully we get better at it. Yeah, but thank you. That's
No
helpful.
problem. All right, let's jump to, okay, I don't know if I can pronounce your name correctly. Vibe?
Yeah, it's fine. So we already have a production application.
Yeah.
And application is like in V1. We launched it like 4 months back, and we have consistent users. But what we have been struggling with is building trust with the users. So the application works decently, but we are basically a customer feedback analytics platform, and people can come and connect their sender support or other channels where they're getting feedback, and then we provide them like actionable insights on top of it, plus a chat. Now with the chat interface, we have a taxonomy that we built, but with the taxonomy, it's always like lagging behind. So if they have like some recent issues that are coming in, the refresh of the taxonomy might take some time. So in those cases, what ends up happening is we try to do like a rack system wherein we fetch like some key records and then put it into an LLM and try to provide some insights. And those insights are decent. But the problem we face there is those are not quantifiable. So you cannot tell them, okay, this has happened this many times, because we have a limited context window. We cannot on the fly compute, okay, how many people have said this. So how do we ensure that we can continue to maintain that trust with the customer while still being able to solve this problem in a systematic manner wherein we are able to actually surface to them, even though we haven't computed this insight right now, we'll be able to get this insight to you within a few minutes or in a couple of minutes.
I feel like one of the constraints here really is the latency, right? I think I've done some social media analysis tools, and usually it's been the case where you upload some data, you tell us some configuration, and then we say, great, we'll email you once we have more like holistic results, right? The other thing, I guess another thing which is hard is like, how can we like downsample that data? And then, so the first question is like, are we able to downsample that data and report that in some productive way where we said, okay, if I can only afford 5 minutes and I know the latency of a single compute, can I figure out how much data I can afford to process given this constraint? And then when I give the results, I might be able to say, here's the summary of my results, and then here are the examples that led to this summary in some kind of citation manner. And we can say, hey, if you have 5 minutes, we can do a 0.5% sample. If you have 50 minutes, it's going to be more comprehensive.
So
that's like the most naive thought I have.
Currently, what ends up happening is the ingestion is happening live. So we connect to their sources and we directly continue ingesting. So now their expectation is whenever they come in and ask a question, we should have the insights ready already. But we might not have them ready because you can never be 100% accurate in terms of what you extract. You extract, like say, something that you find is useful for the customer, but the customer might feel, okay, this is information is missing. So that is available only in the raw feedback. So that is the big challenge right now. Like the expectation is within 20 seconds or 30 seconds, you'll get the insight that you're looking for. And the questions they can ask is they're product managers, so they have very complicated questions,
Right.
which can require very deep analysis, but they want very good latency. They want us to match perplexity kind of thing. So
what ends up being like at stake for these product managers? Like, so one of the things that, like, we want to build trust, like what happens to them if the trust is broken, like versus
yeah, so they start to feel like the platform itself is not providing enough value. So we have like Figma as a customer, and one of their top executives came to the platform, just tried out the chat interface for a couple of minutes, felt it's not doing a good job, and now the contract itself is at risk because of the fact that that executive felt it's not delivering enough value. So why are we paying for this? So these kinds of situations end up happening, even though we have like a robust other reporting suite that consists of dashboards and other things that do provide value to the customers. But since that is the landing page and that is where they first come in, their expectation is it should answer all my questions out of the box, even though you haven't really told it how to answer them. And the range of questions can be very broad to very specific. So we try to do text to SQL and then try to filter the domain, then curate a set of records, and then try to answer using that. But still, that might not hit the mark. So how do we ensure that we set the right expectations there?
Yeah, I mean, yeah. I don't know if I can give very specific advice, but like when you say this, the two avenues that I would potentially explore is like, are there components in the UI that can help expectations, right? For example, just like if we show the kinds of questions that we want you to ask, can we drive them in a direction that makes sense? Can we try to like propose questions that we can answer? The second thing might be a little bit more of like a product design decision where if I was put on this project, like basically what I would try to do is, okay, can I detect the difference between an easy and a hard question? And when it is a hard question, instead of asking the language model to do it, can I point them somewhere else and like make it less of my problem? Right? It's like,
Right.
oh, like you are asking some complex question that is like a financial related thing. Here are products that we can recommend. Contact the sales team and understand some other solutions. Because I think what ends up happening is you're kind of making the intern the representative to some executive, and really the answer, like what you really want to tell the intern is like, okay, if you don't understand, like do not try to answer something and answer the question. Do not like mess up the sale. There are people to contact, et cetera, et cetera. And so maybe one other attempt is really just understanding like what is the category of questions we don't do well, and how can we de-risk that with additional UI or triage, especially if this is part of the like demo that we want to show an executive to sort of potentially make a sale. It's probably a little bit of a cop out, but usually when I run into these issues, I just imagine myself thinking, okay, this LLM system is kind of the intern. What kind of support structure have I provided? And then you realize like I would never let the intern speak to the executive, and without me present or without having some kind of script that says, hey, like you can just show them a different landing page. You should just tell them to contact sales and to speak to my manager, and that's kind of like the how you de-risk some of this probabilistic software. Yeah, might not be the best answer, but I think that's if I was to answer on the spot, that's kind of the direction I would probably explore next.
Yeah, it makes sense also. Like we cannot make it to be 100% accurate. We cannot deliver on everything that they're expecting. So we need to set expectations. If you're not satisfied, this is some other ways in which you can still go ahead and serve your request. You can reach out to
and I think it's good to, and maybe the answer too is just come back and say, hey, maybe the question that the executive answer is not the same kind of question like the users of the software, if we bought it, would be asking. And so another question to think about is like, if the success rate of this product is 60%, is it that every single question that we ask has a 60% chance of success? Or is there some segment that we actually do exceptionally well on and one segment that we can't do well on? And can we predict that and take an action, right? Maybe that's like an LLM classifier. Maybe that's some kind of like classical machine learning model. But I think that just like saying no is a very powerful feature.
Thanks.
Yeah. Not the best answer, but yeah, let's definitely chat on Slack, and maybe we can bring some other ideas.
Sure.
I worked on a project, and this might be too restrictive for you, but we basically had, instead of real text to SQL, we had a library of 150 or so templates of SQL queries. And then because they're templates, we will take the question, we'll use Retrieval to semantic retrieval to figure out which template is closest to it, and then there are fields that can get dropped in. And now for the questions that don't closely match if a question doesn't match anything in our database, we have a sense because of the distance measure. And as a result, you have a way of making sure that you don't do anything too crazy. And if the distance measure is sufficiently far, I guess we do two things. One, if the distance measure is really far, we just say, sorry, we don't know. But then the other part is that whatever they type in, we're actually going to tell them, here's the template that's being used, and here's the fields that are being dropped in, so that we can give them a concrete guarantee of it might not match your question, but we can tell you what we're answering.
Yeah, makes sense. So for our text-to-SQL, we have a slightly different approach wherein what we do is we tried the library, but that didn't work for us too well because questions were too complicated. So what we then ended up doing was breaking it down into an AST, which basically had like some phrases or filters and then the connections between those phrases. And that has worked quite nicely for us, wherein the composition is quite nice. We are able to like do it 95% of the times correctly. And then the extraction itself is like at 70 to 80%. We are trying to bring that up as well. So that has worked well for us. But the planning itself is like very hard for us. So given a question, how do you figure out what are the steps that need to be taken? That has been the most challenging piece for us to solve. And agents are not really very deterministic in nature. They can do something very good sometimes and then mess it up again. So that piece has been the biggest challenge. And then the other piece is if we haven't extracted the insight, then how do we ensure we keep the trust? So those are the two critical pillars we're still working on trying to solve.
I see. Yeah, that makes sense. I think a part of it is just like if you're able to say no, I feel more confident in your ability to know when you can say yes. So that's kind of like the direct answer. Yeah, Matthew, do you want to shoot?
Yeah, I think there was another hand raised, or am I the only one? Is that okay? I think I did it after.
Yeah, I think I see the ordering. I think it was like.
Oh, okay.
Go ahead.
Okay, so I also have two questions, but one of them is shorter, and I'll start with that. So we have users who drop in documents, and when they do that, we basically convert them to Markdown right away, and we chunk them. But our chunking is a very lazy chunking right now. So we just do like sections. We actually put it into an AST, but then we do sections and then a section and whatever content is below it. And we've conflated those chunks we use them as UI display, and we've conflated that with our vector search as well. And I'm just wondering what you have, like what your idea on strategies are to kind of unify those two worlds, where the UI display is a chunk of text that when the user loads the app, it goes boop, 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 and loads all the chunks. So how do we kind of reconcile that world with the chunks that are made so that we can do things like vector similarity search, which I imagine won't be as clean or the same as a heading and then content in Markdown. We use PG vectors to do vector similarity search right now, so they're kind of all in the same place.
I don't think I understand what you think you're missing out on. Is it the fact that some of these like header paragraph blocks are just too large for the embeddings to be done well, or
too short? Like some of the headers are just like a little header, like just like a single little piece of text. And one chunk with header and then content could be very long. And there's no meaningful work we've put into like actually doing chunking so that it facilitates vector similarity search.
I see. Yeah, I think if you watch the talk from ChromaDB on some of the experimentations, like what Anton basically recommended was just making sure that we have some kind of minimum token size as well, where you can just like greedily append data to this chunk until it hits 600 tokens, and then potentially either doing the sliding window over it or doing something like the recursive text splitter, where you say, okay, now I have a sequence of chunks. If I split in the middle, do I hit this like 600 to 800 token limit? If I don't, let's recursively split that again. And really it's just a matter of having some kind of minimum chunk size plus some overlap. Unfortunately, like I don't really have too many best practices there. Like most of what we've done is just either using the recursive text splitter, or like my preference is just like 800 tokens with 50% overlap. I find that if you use a mix of semantic search and full text search, like I've never gotten like different results by changing from like 25% overlap to 50% overlap. It's usually just the case that if it's like about less than 100 tokens, it tends to perform pretty poorly.
Okay. So if I do that process really well, would it be okay to have kind of two different representations of these chunks? One for UI display, which is more like similar to the actual markdown chunking, and one for just this vector search, and we have these two bodies of slightly redundant data. That way, when we do like vector similarity search to do inference to pass it as context to the AI, then we get chunks from this semantic search, semantic chunking process or something. And then when we can just display in the UI the other chunks. Is that appropriate to have like two sets like that?
I think that makes sense, right? If anything, like there could be some like smaller optimizations where we say, okay, the embedding is just a pointer to some list of chunks that are in a sequence. One of the benefits of this as well is when you do citations, if you have sort of like these UI-based chunk IDs, you can cite very, very refined sections, right? Like you can say like, oh, where in what section did we talk about this? Where's the answer to this question or answer this question and include these like IDs, you're going to be able to like reference those chunks in a very like precise way. But yeah, like unless storage is an issue, I don't really foresee like a big issue except for maybe like making sure the data is in sync.
Okay.
Graph databases are a good thing to use. Like it'll really be very helpful because like like we had like text documents split like map for application use as well as to do vector search using graph database. So we had the primary documents as a node and we just broke it down into different structures depending on either at a paragraph level or a section level. So depending on which search matched, then we always knew like where to go back, where was the source document, which department it belonged to. It also helped us with security and data governance as well. So it's like graph might be a good, I know your PG Victor, graph might be a good place for you to start on this.
Thank you.
What was your second question?
Is this the appropriate place to ask for like advice on our whole pipeline, basically like how we're doing retrieval, and maybe it's kind of long, so maybe this is not the right
Yeah,
place.
I mean, if anything, just like message me on Slack, like message us in the
Okay.
Ask channel, and we can just like have a conversation. If it's long,
Great,
I can
okay.
share a Loom video, stuff like that.
Okay, I'll do that. Thank you.
That's good. All right, Azil.
So I got a couple of questions here. So
Yep.
the first question is about hybrid retrieval. Do you normally provide weightage for the various hybrid retrieval methods? And if so, how do you decide before giving weightage to these individual methods?
Yeah, so I tend to use like LansDB, and I don't think there's much control in the weighting versus if you use something like Elasticsearch and like Vespa. Like the bad answer really is I usually just have a set of evaluations, and then usually what I find is we just kind of treat them as hyperparameters and then just run our evaluation suite. A very specific example was in the construction company I worked with. We just realized that a lot of the construction workers know the name of the document they care about, and so they just included the title a lot. And it was just a case of, okay, we changed the title weight for this category of queries, and we were able to do like 12% better recall as long as we removed the underscores from the file name. And so a lot of that ended up just being like by having that evaluation set, we can just figure out what the right weights are.
Sure. And what about the individual methods itself? Suppose if I'm doing a lexical search, and then if I'm doing lexical retrieval combined with, say, vector retrieval, do you normally provide weightage among these retrieval methods?
The simplest thing that we've done is just using the cohere re-ranker as a final step, right? Usually we can afford the additional latency. Mostly because otherwise we have to work with like missing scores. It's not always the case that a single document has both a cosine distance and a lexical like a BM25 score. Like we could train a separate re-ranker that just takes in two values that are both nullable. I think that's just like I would rather just make the cohere API call than like have someone own like a two parameter model that learns the ranking, because we tend to not have that data.
Awesome, got it. So I have one more question. It's about information extraction. So I'm extracting huge data from a huge corpus of text, unstructured data. So how can I evaluate this information extraction process? I know you can ask synthetic questions to evaluate whether the information is there or not. But is there any other mechanism to do it?
I feel like that question is probably going to be a little bit more underspecified, because it depends on like, are we extracting like one example is like even with a summary, right? Like the fact that whether it's abstractive or extractive could change how we do our evaluation, So I would probably say like if you have a better example of what the schema looks like, we can like start that conversation on Slack. Mostly because a lot of it ends up being like what is the actual evaluation, right? If I am doing structured extraction over transcripts and the thing I want to extract is action items, then a very specific evaluation is like, did I correctly extract all the action items and did I assign them to the right people? That just becomes a data set we build out versus like making sure we're parsing like net revenue out of financial documents. Again, that just becomes like the strings must like the numbers must equal, right? We're not going to evaluate some like distance squared metric for some numerical value. So it's going to be very specific to what exactly you're extracting.
Got it. Got it. Yeah, sure. And what are your thoughts about evaluation tools like Ragas and other libraries?
Yeah, generally they just tend to be too slow for the quick evaluation loop, right? So again, if we do use like recall, each computation takes like a millisecond. If we use Ragas, each computation takes 10 seconds. And now if I have a lot of data, like every test is 40 minutes. Right. And so if I have these small things where I want to change the title boost, now changing the title boost will cost me like 40 minutes and $200 of OpenAI credits. And I tend to feel like that just decentivizes a lot of the engineers to actually run these experiments. Because then you just do a stand up one day. It's like, who spent $1,000? Right. So I really prefer to like focus most on recall. The second thing is that oftentimes you're going to want your own evaluation prompt, right? It's very unlikely that we just sort of like import the factuality prompt and like what I care about actually is factuality. Again, if you think of the example of transcripts, that okay, I'm going to produce an executive summary and a list of action items. Well, they don't actually provide like my like action item accuracy recall evaluation, and so I end up having to just build my own prompts anyway. In which case, I would rather just use async gather and do some evaluation. Mostly because also these libraries change every month and I have to upgrade, or like they're not doing like concurrency the right way, and so those are the kind of things that sort of bite me in the ass every like month or two.
Thank you. Very helpful. Yeah.
Vito?
Hey Jason, hey Dan. First of all, like thanks so much for the course. I'm getting a ton of value out of it. I'm going through it really slowly. So like I've been like super rewatching and doing lots of exercises related to like the retrieval metrics. So I'm the technical CEO of anycase.ai. So we do RAG over legal documents. And I'm kind of looking for just intuition because legal documents, they're quite long and a lot of relevant information can be scattered across these documents. So I was wondering if you had any experience with like multiple or multi-level summarization. So like one problem we have is, right, when you retrieve like the top K chunks, sometimes like there's a relevant chunk, but there's some legal definition that the distance between the query and that relevant chunk isn't very near. So like my intuition is maybe we can create like summarizations over sub documents or larger chunks of documents and add that to the RAG system. But I'm wondering if I'm going down a dead end and you have anything to share about that.
Yeah, I'm very bullish on summarization. The thing that ends up being tricky is making sure that we're somehow quantifying the quality of that summary. So we're kind of replacing one difficult problem with another, right? Like in the context of like in the chain of summary paper, one of the things they were doing is like, okay, we're gonna fine tune a language model to summarize in such a way that we keep all the named entities, right? And so if in this like 10-page document there were 17 named entities, when you summarize it, there's got to be 17 named entities, right? Like if my transcript had a name like Jason said this, my summary can't be the speaker said this, right? And so you just got to figure out like what is the actual metric you're going to use that captures that. And I don't have an intuition, like I don't know if it's just like clause density or something like that, because that just might be evaluating like extractive summarization. And the second thing again is to make sure that when we do recall, this summary is also is actually helping the recall. Does that help? Like sort of maybe just like we're really just trading one problem for another in my mind. But I don't think I've worked in enough legal context to sort of give like a
right. Maybe just like your consulting projects, right? Has any of the systems been improved by adding like a bunch of summarization, or like I hear you using it with tables, right, and images? You just you create questions for it.
It's been used in a context that's like way less high stakes in law. We do a lot of like marketing, and so one of the things we do is we say, okay, every time there's an objection in a sales call, let's do RAG and see if there's a document we could recommend to the salesperson to overcome the objection. And if we have bad inventory and we don't have a document, we want to generate documents, and then we'll just use those in the future, right? So we're kind of doing this like on the fly rather than sort of doing this summarization just as we ingest data. That's like one example of how we've been using summarization, right? It's like ad hoc creating more context. Yeah, like do you have a specific example of specific example of text chunks that like are not working that you think could be working with a summarization?
Yeah, I think mostly related to like definitions. Can't think of a good one on top of my head, but let's say there's this one section that says, oh, the penalty for this specific kind of murder is this.
Right.
And there are like circumstances there that have legal definitions that are not close to like the query, like the user asks for. Tell me all you know about this this crime. So it's kind of like one hop away from the actual question. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I have not done something that I would say is like production level. One of the things I had an experiment on, which I doubt will work reliably, let me see if I can find it, is effectively trying to extract entities out of documents and then defining edges across entities. Yeah, let me see. Oh, sweet, I actually just called it legal entity extraction. This basically works, but it's not like a production quality system. But so I'll kind of give like a quick overview where I have like properties, entities with dependencies. And then the hypothetical example I created was the agreement is made on this date, and then the initial payment will be 7 days after the sign date, which is obviously like very far away from the document here. And then, yeah, like the final payment will be due like 45 days after the sign date, but the sign date was mentioned somewhere else. And by defining this graph, you can kind of extract some notion of structure, right? Where I think, yeah, the delivery date is like 30 days after the agreement date. The agreement date is this. But we're still just kind of replacing one problem with another. So I think I haven't confirmed that if this problem is actually easier than the initial problem. But this is to say that I think there is some hope and some possibility that we can be extracting some of this information out.
Gotcha. Thanks for that. Could I get the link? I didn't quite see the URL there.
No problem. I'll just send this on Zoom. Yeah, I think the challenge is like if you start using a graph, now you just start thinking like, okay, like what is the graph structure? What are the types of entities? When I do queries, like how much do I have to resolve? Yeah, it's just unclear that if we replace one problem with another, the second problem is easier. That's kind of yeah, exactly, more problems. Yeah. I don't know if that fully answered your question, just because I think that context is hard. Even like one problem I know that was happening with a buddy of mine was they were very sensitive to low precision. So not even just finding the right references, but just if you have just a mess of clauses, the language model gets extremely confused, right? And so I think there's a ton of things that are going on there that might be an issue. But you could imagine, says like, if you do build out this graph, for any clause that is included, traverse two edges as code, and just make sure we include that as well. Matthew, is your hand still raised, or did you have another question?
Sorry, I think it's Matthew.
Yeah.
I think I got that. Thanks so much.
No other question from me. Sorry about that.
Okay.
Thank you.
There's a question from Shubham in the chat.
Have we experience in specialized embedding models for tabular data? This is interesting. Let me just take a look at this. I do look a lot into specialized models, but I have not looked at one that's specifically for tabular data. Okay, wait. So that I will say that I believe that there exists specialized embedding models that can perform better on tabular data. But I think that would also suggest that you might live in a world where you have a single index that is tabular data. I don't know how you might think about wanting to mix that, but yeah, I have not experienced, I don't have any experience in specialized embeddings for tabular data, but next week we're mostly going to talk about model fine-tuning and fine-tuning embedding models. And you're really going to find that even with 1,000 or 2,000 examples of questions and chunks that should be returned, you will pretty convincingly outperform anything from OpenAI or for any of these companies. And I generally believe that if you have 10,000 examples of questions and chunks that are cited or have a rating, you should be fine-tuning, right? Just because I think the embedding model is the easiest model to train and it is the easiest model to inference. And if you want to sort of ever put yourself in a situation you're fighting CUDA errors, like that's going to be the most lightweight work to do. Whereas when you start thinking about fine-tuning language models, it's a lot heavier to sort of reason about. And like fine-tuning embedding models is what Netflix does for movie recommendations. It's what Spotify does for playlists. It's what Shopify does, you know. And the companies that don't do that are like blockbuster, right? And so specialization, I think, is very, very strong, very, very beneficial.
I commented that I have not used specialized embedding models for tabular data. And so this is just off the cuff. It seems to me like an unnecessary idea, like tabular data, they either start as numbers or maybe you have some categoricals and then it's trivial to convert them to all numbers. And even like typically it's trivial to convert them to a dense representation. And then the real challenge that I think you're hoping the embedding model solves is figuring out how to stretch that space or shrink that space so that some features get weighted more than others. And I'd be pretty skeptical that some pre-trained embedding model understands your tabular data better than you do. So I would just get like, it's already a bunch of numbers, and then I would just use some judgment to figure out which columns do I want to divide to, like, you can imagine standardizing them, then they all are weighted the same. But it seems like, not having thought about this very much, it seems like embedding models just don't seem unnecessary and not a great fit for this problem.
Yeah, I guess, okay, let me think. I can probably come up with one case that could make sense for the construction project I work with, which is that if I am chunking like slivers of sort of specification tables, that there might be some similarity between like 3/4 versus like 1/4 inch screw or something like that. And then what we're really doing is we're trying to make the embedding model robust to like all the different commas or the pipe commas in like a markdown table, and just making sure that like it's robust to like commas versus markdown like pipes. But I think that's the only example I can think of is like really robustness against like this formatting behavior.
I guess tables of text also would be very different from tables of numbers.
Yeah. I think for specs it might make sense, but that's the only example where I think something weird you could benefit from the tokenization. Sudhir says, why do I prefer LanceDB versus other vector databases? I prefer LanceDB in prototyping primarily because their API makes hybrid search and re-ranking very simple. And so I can just basically pass in a string and say mode equals hybrid dot re-rank, and I kind of get exactly what I'm looking for. And on top of that, because of the way they do their arrow representation, that same table I can write SQL against, which allows me to build both hybrids, like re-rankers, hybrid search, and text-to-SQL with a single backend. And that's just something that I find pretty convenient. And then the difference between why I use that versus something like Postgres is just because of the fact that for LanceDB, it's all built on object storage. And so it's almost like it's like SQLite plus vectors plus text search. And I think that works pretty well in a local setting. There's also tons of reasons not to use like LanceDB. Like, for example, a robust like cloud solution, right? Their LanceDB does not have full text search yet, for example. But I think there are pros and cons to every vector database. Like I use ChromaDB if I want to set up an application in like 10 minutes. ChromaDB is like the easiest thing to set up. Whereas like LanceDB and TimberPuffer really benefit from the way they do object storage. If I know that I have 1,000 or like 100,000 users, I can partition each file in S3 to be the index of a single user. And then what I have to load in memory is a very small object. Whereas if I want to make a recommendation for 100 million SKUs in a e-commerce website, then the Pinecone or Vespa is going to be a better option because it's a single index with tons and tons of vectors rather than many indices of like millions of vectors. But I've really only tried like Lance, Chroma, Pinecone for some of the projects. Cool. Was there any other questions, any thoughts, concerns, feedback from the course? Oh, Lewis?
Howdy. Was just curious how you've seen people do like confidence scores on responses from LLMs. I guess, yeah, there are different ways of doing it, like an additional step after the sort of generation step, sort of asking for this content. Like, are there any hallucinations? Like, what's the level of changes that have been made to the original content? But yeah, I'm curious what you've seen.
So are you saying like, can we ask the language model to self-grade its own generated response?
Yeah, I guess for context, so co-founder of a company that automates responding to RFPs, request for proposals, and like security questionnaires, stuff like that. So yeah, we find how they've responded to similar requirements in the past, and then run that through an LLM to sort of rewrite the response to address the new requirement. But yeah, depending on how different those requirements are, like it can make pretty significant changes. And so the way we've sort of handled it so far is using the relevance score from re-rank. So essentially, if the past sort of requirements very similar, we can assume that the language model won't have to make too many changes, so they can sort of trust the response.
Right.
But yeah, just curious. Any thoughts around that?
I guess my second question is what does your user do with the confidence score?
Yeah, so they sort the responses, and the ones that have a lower confidence score, they would sort of put more time into making sure that they've sort of reviewed manually themselves first.
Right. Yeah, okay. I guess the first thing I would do is try to reduce the notion of confidence to be like much more quantifiable metrics. So for example, like whether or not we have a citation is like a much more quantifiable thing of like, okay, if this response just has no citation because I couldn't find something explicit, okay, there's an issue, right? Then you could say, okay, in the presence of a citation, there's a bunch of different kinds of like string metrics. What is the like string distance between my generator response and the citation response, right?
Yeah.
I don't think it will be like 11 sign distance, but there's going to be something, right?
Yeah.
That's going to help us sort of compute a difference. It's okay, does it have a citation score? If so, is there some match? And then you can do even more complex things where you can have the language model grade individual systems situations, right? And so there is the if no citations, like red light, if citations, we can compute the string distance. And obviously if you just sort of like quoted verbatim what the document said, maybe this is something I feel good about. If there's a big gap, then we can sort of triage to some LLM grader where again we want to sort of like with this I mostly use like rubrics, right, where there's like maybe a score that I care about. There are examples of good pairs and bad pairs, and then you can just say, okay, given these citations, do these citations align with what you quoted? And then so you kind of have like a hierarchy of like complexity that you can sort of play with on a sliding scale. Yeah, so that's one thing. I also think if you're using local models, there is this avenue that you can explore with like attention mechanisms, but I don't really think about those things anymore just because I only use OpenAI. I don't know if Dan has anything else to think about some of those things.
Yeah, I mean the attention angle is an interesting one. The only other thing I'd say is I think there's, and maybe you've already thought about this, there's probably a lot to do just with the UI of making sure that whatever you're pulling out gets highlighted so that someone can easily sit side by side, see here's the thing we wrote, but then side by side, like here's highlighted text that we think is what it's pulled from, making sure that it's just surfacing the citations in a transparent way.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, it's really helpful.
I also give a very specific prompting tip that dramatically improved the results that we get, which is, and am I correct to assume that we're going to basically have like fields that are kind of softly defined and then responses that we generate for each field? So one thing that we found in practice that works like very well is for every field, instead of just saying like, give me the field title and the response, I say, first give me the field title, then reiterate the instructions for that field table. So now like basically the latest generated text has already attended to the instructions in your prompt. And then you say, repeat back all the relevant sections from the original context. And then you generate the response. And like the interpretation is basically all the data that you want the language model to attend to now is just in a very focused area of the text. It became field, instructions, sources, and then the text. And then you basically, if you just ask for that data in XML, you can just throw out the instructions and the sources that you generate. And what we found is it just makes the quality of the answer much higher in general. And so an example could be, here's a 1 hour transcript. Here's like 6 pages of our pricing documentation. What kind of pricing should we offer this customer? And now it says like, okay, first let me reiterate what the pricing options that might look relevant. Let me then return the conversation snippets that made us think that this is the right variables we care about for this pricing formula. And then we like sort of use the LLM to compute the pricing formula. And what this also means is when you do this review process, if you really care, you can actually refer back to the sources that the language model said and the source and the instruction the language model tried to debug. So you just sort of like, when you do lose confidence, you can just basically look at the language model and say like, what were you thinking? And if the instructions don't show up, we can sort of reiterate and work on the prompt. And effectively what you're doing is you're allowing yourselves to say, okay, when I review this, there's a computed confidence score. but also there's kind of like the LLM explanation. And if the LLM explanation does not align with the quality of the answer, I can go back and work on the prompt to do that. In general, just repeating instructions, quoting the relevant data text, and then giving the answer immediately is something that we use in production a lot because it just seems to make the reasoning a lot better. You kind of like repeat like find the needles, list them out, and then answer the question. This is kind of like a secret that I've worked out.
Yeah. And that's including, like, you'll include citations in your final response typically, or is that out of curiosity?
Yeah, I in the specific thing I would do is like for all the chunks, I just give each one like an artificial ID, and then in my prompt I say treat these IDs as if they're like URLs, and when you give a citation, just include them in like square brackets. Here's an example. And then as long as you sort of like organize the chunks in your code for every citation, then you can just basically say, okay, this one part, my regular expression parsed out of 2. Let me figure out what the citation 2 is, and I can now render them side by side. And then if I want to use an LLM, I can say, given what you said plus citation 2, LLM, tell me if this was interpreted correctly. And so there's a lot of things you can do with playing around citations. I'll try to be more concrete in week 6 when we talk about some of this like response generation stuff, but that has been like a very, very impactful thing. Like just making the language model repeat itself has been very good.
Yeah, awesome. That's super helpful. Thanks,
Yeah.
Lutz.
Sorry for the ramble. It's something that just works like magic to me, so I'm like very superstitious about it.
Yeah. And after no doubt testing a lot of different things.
Yeah, I think we're at time. My laptop is at 2% battery, so if I just hang up all of a sudden, I apologize. But yeah, if there's any other questions, again, just feel free to message the Ask Instructors channel. If you did not join that channel, make sure to join. And yeah, I'll see you guys next week if there's no more questions. Awesome.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.